Contents. Preface. Chapter 1. Welcome to Economics. Introduction. 1.1. What is economics, and why is it important? 1.2. Microeconomics and macroeconomics. 1.3. How economists use theories and models to understand economic issues. 1.4. How to organize economies. An overview of economic systems. Key terms, key concepts and summary. Self-check questions, review questions, critical thinking questions. Chapter 2. Choice in a World of Scarcity. Introduction to Choice in a World of Scarcity. 2.1. How individuals make choices based on their budget constraint. 2.2. The production possibilities, frontier and social choices. 2.3. Confronting objections to the economic approach. Key terms, key concepts and summary. Self-check questions, review questions, critical thinking questions, problems. Chapter 3. Demand and Supply. Introduction to Demand and Supply. 3.1. Demand, Supply, and Equilibrium in Markets for Goods and Services. 3.2. Shifts in Demand and Supply for Goods and Services. 3.3. Changes in Equilibrium Price and Quantity. The four-step process. 3.4. Price ceilings and price floors. 3.5. Demand, Supply, and Efficiency. Key terms, key concepts and summary. Self-check questions, review questions, critical thinking questions, problems. Chapter 4. Labor and Financial Markets. Introduction to Labor and Financial Markets. 4.1. Demand and Supply at Work in Labor Markets. 4.2. Demand and Supply in Financial Markets. 4.3. The market system as an efficient mechanism for information. Key terms, key concepts and summary. Self-check questions, review questions, critical thinking questions, problems. Chapter 5. Elasticity. Introduction to Elasticity. 5.1. Price elasticity of demand and price elasticity of supply. 5.2. Polar cases of elasticity and constant elasticity. 5.3. Elasticity and pricing. 5.4. Elasticity in areas other than price. Key terms, key concepts and summary. Self-check questions, review questions, critical thinking questions, problems. Chapter 6. Consumer Choices. Introduction to Consumer Choices. 6.1. Consumption Choices. 6.2. How changes in income and prices affect consumption choices. 6.3. Behavioral Economics. An alternative framework for consumer choice. Key terms, key concepts and summary. Self-check questions, review questions, critical thinking questions, problems. Chapter 7. Production, Costs, and Industry Structure. Introduction to Production, Costs, and Industry Structure. 7.1. Explicit and Implicit Costs, and Accounting and Economic Profit. 7.2. Production in the Short Run. 7.3. Costs in the Short Run. 7.4. Production in the Long Run. 7.5. Costs in the Long Run. Key terms, key concepts and summary. Self-check questions, review questions, critical thinking questions, problems. Chapter 8. Perfect Competition. Introduction to Perfect Competition. 8.1. Perfect competition and why it matters. 8.2. How perfectly competitive firms make output decisions. 8.3. Entry and exit decisions in the long run. 8.4. Efficiency in perfectly competitive markets. Key terms, key concepts and summary. Self-check questions, review questions, critical thinking questions, problems. Chapter 9. Monopoly. Introduction to a Monopoly. 9.1. How monopolies form. Barriers to entry. 9.2. How a profit-maximizing monopoly chooses output and price. Key terms, key concepts and summary. Self-check questions, review questions, critical thinking questions, problems. Chapter 10. Monopolistic Competition and Oligopoly. Introduction to Monopolistic Competition and Oligopoly. 10.1. Monopolistic Competition. 10.2. Oligopoly. Key terms, key concepts and summary, self-check questions, review questions, critical thinking questions, problems. Chapter 11, Monopoly and Antitrust Policy. Introduction to Monopoly and Antitrust Policy. 11.1, Corporate Mergers. 11.2, Regulating Anti-Competitive Behavior. 11.3, Regulating Natural Monopolies. 11.4, The Great Deregulation Experiment. Key terms, key concepts and summary, self-check questions, review questions, critical thinking questions, problems. Chapter 12, Environmental Protection and Negative Externalities. Introduction to Environmental Protection and Negative Externalities. 12.1, The Economics of Pollution. 12.2, Command and Control Regulation. 12.3, Market-Oriented Environmental Tools. 12.4, The Benefits and Costs of U.S. Environmental Laws. 12.5, International Environmental Issues. 12.6, The Trade-off between Economic Output and Environmental Protection. Key terms, key concepts and summary, self-check questions, review questions, critical thinking questions, problems. Chapter 13, Positive Externalities and Public Goods. Introduction to Positive Externalities and Public Goods. 13.1, Investments in Innovation. 13.2, How Governments Can Encourage Innovation. 13.3, Public Goods, Key Terms, Key Concepts and Summary, Self-Check Questions, Review Questions, Critical Thinking Questions, Problems. CHAPTER 14, Labor Markets and Income. Introduction to Labor Markets and Income. 14.1, The Theory of Labor Markets. 14.2, Wages and Employment in an Imperfectly Competitive Labor Market. 14.3, Market Power on the Supply Side of Labor Markets, Unions. 14.4, Bilateral Monopoly. 14.5, Employment Discrimination. 14.6, Immigration, Key Terms, Key Concepts and Summary, Self-Check Questions, Review Questions, Critical Thinking Questions. Chapter 15, Poverty and Economic Inequality. Introduction to Poverty and Economic Inequality. 15.1, Drawing the Poverty Line. 15.2, The Poverty Trap. 15.3, The Safety Net. 15.4, Income Inequality, Measurement and Causes. 15.5, Government Policies to Reduce Income Inequality. Key Terms, Key Concepts and Summary, Self-Check Questions, Review Questions, Critical Thinking Questions, Problems. Chapter 16, Information, Risk, and Insurance. Introduction to Information, Risk, and Insurance. 16.1, The Problem of Imperfect Information and Asymmetric Information. 16.2, Insurance and Imperfect Information, Key Terms, Key Concepts and Summary, Self-Check Questions, Review Questions, Critical Thinking Questions, Problems. Chapter 17, Financial Markets. Introduction to Financial Markets. 17.1, How Businesses Raise Financial Capital. 17.2, How Households Supply Financial Capital. 17.3, How to Accumulate Personal Wealth. Key Terms, Key Concepts and Summary, Self-Check Questions, Review Questions, Critical Thinking Questions, Problems. Chapter 18, Public Economy. Introduction to Public Economy. 18.1, Voter Participation and Costs of Elections. 18.2, Special Interest Politics. 18.3, Flaws in the Democratic System of Government. Key Terms, Key Concepts and Summary, Self-Check Questions, Review Questions, Critical Thinking Questions, Problems. Chapter 19, The Macroeconomic Perspective. Introduction to the Macroeconomic Perspective. 19.1, Measuring the Size of the Economy, Gross Domestic Product. 19.2, Adjusting Nominal Values to Real Values. 19.3, Tracking Real GDP Over Time. 19.4, Comparing GDP among countries. 19.5, How well GDP measures the well-being of society. Key Terms, Key Concepts and Summary, Self-Check Questions, Review Questions, critical thinking questions, problems. Chapter 20, Economic Growth. Introduction to Economic Growth, 20.1. The relatively recent arrival of economic growth, 20.2. Labor productivity and economic growth, 20.3. Components of economic growth, 20.4. Economic convergence, key terms, key concepts and summary, self-check questions, review questions, critical thinking questions, problems. Chapter 21, Unemployment. Introduction to Unemployment, 21.1. How economists define and compute unemployment rate, 21.2. Patterns of unemployment, 21.3. What causes changes in unemployment over the short run, 21.4. What causes changes in unemployment over the long run? Key terms, key concepts and summary, self-check questions, review questions, critical thinking questions, problems. Chapter 22, Inflation. Introduction to Inflation, 22.1. Tracking Inflation, 22.2. How to measure changes in the cost of living, 22.3. How the U.S. and other countries experience inflation, 22.4. The confusion over inflation, 22.5. Indexing and its limitations, key terms, key concepts and summary, self-check questions, review questions, critical thinking questions. Problems. Chapter 23, The International Trade and Capital Flows. Introduction to the International Trade and Capital Flows, 23.1. Measuring Trade Balances, 23.2. Trade Balances in Historical and International Context, 23.3. Trade Balances and Flows of Financial Capital, 23.4. The National Saving and Investment Identity, 23.5. The Pros and Cons of Trade Deficits and Surpluses, 23.6. The difference between level of trade and the trade balance. Key terms, key concepts and summary, self-check questions, review questions, critical thinking questions, problems. Chapter 24, The Aggregate Demand, Aggregate Supply Model. Introduction to the Aggregate Supply Aggregate Demand Model, 24.1. Macroeconomic Perspectives on Demand and Supply, 24.2. Building a Model of Aggregate Demand and Aggregate Supply, 24.3. Shifts in Aggregate Supply, 24.4. Shifts in Aggregate Demand, 24.5. How the AD/AS model incorporates growth, unemployment, and inflation, 24.6. Keynes' Law and Say's Law in the AD/AS model. Key terms, key concepts and summary, self-check questions, review questions, critical thinking question, problems. Chapter 25, The Keynesian Perspective. Introduction to the Keynesian Perspective, 25.1. Aggregate Demand in Keynesian Analysis, 25.2. The Building Blocks of Keynesian Analysis, 25.3. The Phillips Curve, 25.4. The Keynesian Perspective on Market Forces. Key terms, key concepts and summary, self-check questions, review questions, critical thinking questions. Chapter 26, The Neoclassical Perspective. Introduction to the Neoclassical Perspective, 26.1. The Building Blocks of Neoclassical Analysis. 26.2. The Policy Implications of the Neoclassical Perspective, 26.3. Balancing Keynesian and Neoclassical Models. Key terms, key concepts and summary, self-check questions, review questions, critical thinking questions, problems. Chapter 27, Money and Banking. Introduction to Money and Banking, 27.1. Defining money by its functions, 27.2. Measuring money, currency, M1 and M2, 27.3. The Role of Banks, 27.4. How Banks Create Money, Key Terms, Key Concepts and Summary, Self-Check Questions, Review Questions, Critical Thinking Questions, Problems. Chapter 28, Monetary Policy and Bank Regulation. Introduction to Monetary Policy and Bank Regulation, 28.1. The Federal Reserve Banking System and Central Banks, 28.2. Bank regulation. 28.3. How a central bank executes monetary policy. 28.4. Monetary policy and economic outcomes. 28.5. Pitfalls for monetary policy. Key terms, key concepts and summary. Self-check questions, review questions, critical thinking questions, problems. Chapter 29. Exchange rates and international capital flows. Introduction to exchange rates and international capital flows. 29.1. How the foreign exchange market works. 29.2. Demand and supply shifts in foreign exchange markets. 29.3. Macroeconomic effects of exchange rates. 29.4. Exchange rate policies. Key terms, key concepts and summary. Self-check questions, review questions, critical thinking questions, problems. Chapter 30. Government budgets and fiscal policy. Introduction to government budgets and fiscal policy. 30.1. Government spending. 30.2. Taxation. 30.3. Federal deficits and the national debt. 30.4. Using fiscal policy to fight recession, unemployment, and inflation. 30.5. Automatic stabilizers. 30.6. Practical problems with discretionary fiscal policy. 30.7. The question of a balanced budget. Key terms, key concepts and summary. Self-check questions, review questions, critical thinking questions, problems. Chapter 31. The impacts of government borrowing. Introduction to the impacts of government borrowing. 31.1. How government borrowing affects investment in the trade balance. 31.2. Fiscal policy and the trade balance. 31.3. How government borrowing affects private saving. 31.4. Fiscal policy, investment, and economic growth. Key terms, key concepts and summary. Self-check questions, review questions, critical thinking questions, problems. Chapter 32. Macroeconomic policy around the world. Introduction to macroeconomic policy around the world. 32.1. The diversity of countries and economies across the world. 32.2. Improving countries' standards of living. 32.3. Causes of unemployment around the world. 32.4. Causes of inflation in various countries and regions. 32.5. Balance of trade concerns. Key terms, key concepts and summary. Self-check questions, review questions, critical thinking questions, problems. Chapter 33. International trade. Introduction to international trade. 33.1. Absolute and comparative advantage. 33.2. What happens when a country has an absolute advantage in all goods? 33.3. Intra-industry trade between similar economies. 33.4. The benefits of reducing barriers to international trade. Key terms, key concepts and summary. Self-check questions, review questions, critical thinking questions, problems. Chapter 34. Globalization and protectionism. Introduction to globalization and protectionism. 34.1. Protectionism. An indirect subsidy from consumers to producers. 34.2. International trade and its effects on jobs, wages, and working conditions. 34.3. Arguments in support of restricting imports. 34.4. How governments enact trade policy, globally, regionally, and nationally. 34.5. The trade-offs of trade policy. Key terms, key concepts and summary. Self-check questions, review questions, critical thinking questions, problems. Appendix A. The use of mathematics in principles of economics. Appendix B. Indifference curves. Appendix C. Present discounted value. Appendix D. The expenditure output model. Answer key. References. Index.